Welcome to the third session of the symposium. Rafael and I will host this session. And the first talk will be from Paavo Pylkkänen. And Dr. Paavo Pylkkänen is senior lecturer in theoretical philosophy at the University of Helsinki. And his research uses insights from quantum theory to tackle central problems in philosophy of mind, such as mental causation and hard problem of consciousness. His eclectic approach combines new physics with analytical philosophy, phenomenology, cognitive science, and neuroscience, and he proposes a view in which the mechanistic framework of classical physics and neuroscience is complemented by a more holistic underlying framework, in which conscious experience finds its place more naturally. He is the author of the book Mind, Matter, and the Implicate Order, that I personally highly recommend and read with great interest. So, today, Dr. Pylkkänen will talk about consciousness and its place in the physical world. Welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I guess I'll start with the screen. Sorry, I'm just, sorry, I have just an incoming call there. Yes, let's do a couple of things, like turn off the email so you won't be hearing all silly noises. And let's do share screen. And here. Okay. So does it show now the properly?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So anyway, thanks very much for the kind invitation to participate here with this very prestigious meeting. I will be first talking about consciousness, kind of introduction to, if people are not that familiar with consciousness research, I guess some of you are, but not everybody is, and then move on also to talk about a little bit about this my own research, which uses quantum mechanics there. And so so I guess I'll say something about consciousness problems, theories, not so much actually about integrated information theory, because I think maybe the next speaker, Chris Koch, that's one of the supporters of theory, will say, but I'll say something about quantum theory. So I mean, I'll mention the integrated information theory, but that's a little bit long. So anyway, so you, of course, if you just ask, what is consciousness? I mean, it may be a big question, like, you know, when somebody asks Louis Armstrong, what is jazz? The answer is, if you gotta ask, you ain't never gonna know. So I mean, we might say the same thing about consciousness, or else more historically with St. Augustine, when, you know, question is, what is time? He would say, well, if no one asks me, I know what it is. But if I wish to explain it to him who asks, I do not know. So fair enough, you know, some people feel consciousness to be a bit like that. But anyway, so let's anyway go towards a definition of consciousness. I'm here relying on, actually, Max Wellman's has a very nice book, Understanding Consciousness. He's a psychologist, so it's somewhat different from a philosophical approach, but I like that book very much. And of course, we often say that consciousness is what it is like to be something. This goes back to Thomas Nagel, you know, the article, What is it like to be a bat? And so the idea being, without it, consciousness, it wouldn't be like anything to exist. And we each have what we might call psychological data about what it is like to be conscious or have consciousness, to serve as the basis for an agreed definition. So I mean, some people stop already at this point with consciousness research by saying, well, you know, there's no way we can agree about it. But I think others feel that let's not make it too difficult. There are examples from everyday life. So, you know, there's something in some ways consciousness, something very obvious about consciousness. So we have knowledge of what it's like to be conscious when we are awake, as opposed to having no memory of being conscious when in dreamless sleep. And so we also understand another sense of, you know, the adjective conscious. We understand what it's like to be conscious of something when awake or dreaming, as opposed to not being conscious of that thing. So I mean, it's easy to find examples like this. One terminological issue that's important, that in philosophy, we distinguish mind, the concept mind, from consciousness for the reason that we commonly assume that mental processes may or may not be conscious. So mind is the more general category. So we could have, philosophers like to talk about mental or cognitive systems, even if they, they might not be conscious. But, some people might dispute this, like Searle, claiming that there's kind of a connection between, stronger connection between these two, but anyway. A very important distinction here, which is familiar past, but in this research, is the contrast between third person and first person perspective. The idea being that, for example, in the brain side, neurophysiological accounts are based on third person observations of the brain, whereas consciousness is thought to be a first person phenomenon. And so idea being that we cannot observe someone else's consciousness from the outside. And for Wellmans would emphasize, this means that we cannot take it for granted that third person functional accounts of brain are also accounts of consciousness. I mean, some people just make the assumption, but I think we have to be careful there. And then we come to problems of consciousness. This is actually from another of my consciousness heroes, Robert van Gulik, who's written a very cool article in Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and Consciousness. Actually, I recommend to all brain mind, PhD students, the Stanford Encyclopedia. If you don't know it, this is really a pretty good source if you want to get your first, introduction to philosophy to something. So this is the one way of trying to divide and conquer the problem of consciousness, putting it like this. So there's the descriptive question: what are the features of consciousness? There's the functional question, like, why does consciousness exist? What is its function and role? Why is it important? People might here think of as evolution. Why was it selected? And then there is also the perhaps the most philosophical question, the explanatory question: how can consciousness exist? Here's the hard problem. This goes back to David Chalmers, but of course others before him, where we say that, ask, well, how does consciousness arise from neural processes? A lot of people assume it does, but still, this is where it gets tricky. Remember earlier I said there are some things seem very obvious about consciousness, but this is the puzzling bit. And that's why philosophers have been also thinking about it so much. So just briefly about the features of consciousness. One thing to realize is that we may talk about conscious states and also conscious creatures. And again, conscious versus non-conscious. So that's just to keep in mind. So conscious creature may have non-conscious states, of sort of non-conscious mental states. Famous example is qualia, the qualitative character. That's perhaps the most discussed in philosophy of mind. There's something also we call a phenomenal structure, which refers to more the kind of the reality we construct. This is easier to think about your dreams. So for all that we know, it seems that that brain is constructing this simulation of virtual reality, which has a lot of structure in it, space, time, causality. Of course, all kinds of bizarre things can happen in your dreams, but there's still a structure to it. And this is something that people, of course, it goes back to Kant, phenomenology. A lot of people today are studying this, virtual reality developers and so forth. Subjectivity just refers to this sense that conscious experience, there's the point of view of the subject that seems to be crucial. The subject has sort of access to the facts of what is it like. And so there is also related to that the kind of self-perspectival organization. Then we also talk a lot about the unity of consciousness in various ways. Another very important is this idea of representationality and transparency. There's a sense in which we see through our states. I mean, suppose that your conscious states are nothing but brain states. We still don't experience the mass brain states. We actually see the content. So if you like, we see just through our representations, we see the world. We see the world of objects rather than the medium that's carrying the information. That's what it's called, transparency. And then there's the whole idea of dynamical flow, the stream of consciousness. This is William James, and a lot of literature also we talk about that. This is just, I won't go into it, just to give people a bit of an idea what are those features. There's also the question of the function, why it's important. Here I actually just put together ideas from both Wellmans and Van Gulik. Won't go through all of them, but these are just suggestions of what, that the thing that consciousness is necessary, or at least makes all of these things better. I think for each one of them, you will find people claiming that you could have that without consciousness. But still, I think there are others who, let's say about the free will, somebody might ask, well, what's the point of freedom if you're not even conscious of it, or if you're exercising your free will unconsciously? So what might it mean? I mean, you decide whom you're going to marry or whatever you're going to do, or if you are lucky enough to get to decide. So anyway, but this is just to show that this is one of the reasons why a lot of, perhaps especially in psychology, people really think that, consciousness, it was so much ignored. The C word is still forbidden to use in some so-called respectable scientific circles, but still here is some, like, I think Wellmans, as one of the pioneers of consciousness studies in psychology, he would want you to consider these things, and he would argue why you need consciousness for these kinds of things. And, others might disagree. And now we get to this the philosophically tricky and fascinating question: how can consciousness exist? And here the challenge is explanation rather than description. Our task is to explain the status and place of consciousness in nature. And we could ask things like, well, is consciousness in some ways a fundamental feature of reality, or does its existence depend on other non-conscious things? Could be neural things, or biological, computational, physical, perhaps even quantum physical, like some people think. And here we think, of course, it could go back to, of course, people like Descartes, who thought that there's this res cogitans, thinking substance, which is like, consciousness as a fundamental, interacting then with the brain and the physical world. But this is just to give you a little bit of the options here again. And the question is then that supposing that the existence of consciousness would depend on these non-conscious things, then we ask, well, can we explain and understand how such non-conscious items could cause or realize consciousness? And this again is kind of a version of the hard problem of consciousness. This is a difficult one. There are kind of easier problems where we just think about things like, how does brain combine information? Not that they're trivial, but at least we know how to answer them. But here the idea is that we are not quite clear how to even begin. So, I mean, or put it another way, can we explain how to make something conscious out of things that are non-conscious? It's like getting your conscious rabbit out of your non-conscious hat. I don't know, maybe that's not a good metaphor. And so we can also think about what kinds of frameworks we are using in our explanation. It could be, what are we appealing to? We could appeal to neural processes, biological structures, so-called functional relations, computational organization, this physical mechanism, perhaps even quantum, but also non-conscious mental states, which is kind of quite an attractive option also, that it somehow, if you put certain non-conscious mental states into a certain kind of relation, bingo, one of them becomes conscious. This is, for example, so-called high-order theories of consciousness do this kind of thing. A metacognition might make the lower thing conscious, lower state conscious. And here's a nice chart by this one, Gulik. I modified it a little bit. I put in, for example, the quantum there, because usually in the more mainstream approaches, it's not always mentioned. But here you can see so on the left side, you see the aspect that's to be explained, which I already mentioned to you. In the middle, you got this various frameworks. And in the right side, there's the idea of what kind of relation would then link those two. And the very strong would be logical sufficiency, so that you could just derive the phenomenon from this framework. So a very strong. Nomic sufficiency would appeal to laws. intuitive sufficiency is really what we want in philosophy. I understand how, let's say, consciousness arises from certain neurobiological mechanisms, or even some, if somebody says that, even if you say, take integrated information theory, that somebody says us that consciousness is when information is integrated in a particular way, we might still ask, well, why does that give rise to consciousness, and so on and so forth. And don't we already have many theories of consciousness? Here is a list. My colleague from University of Skövde, Antti Revonsuo, he's also from Turku, a very key figure in consciousness studies in Finland. He has a nice, actually, a textbook on consciousness, and so here's what he calls philosophical theories. Mentioned some of them already, like higher theories. I've added also like this from my own work, which is kind of perhaps not as well known as a theory of consciousness as the other ones, but there is, David Bohm already in 1980 discussed so-called implicated order scheme, and that's my own book discusses that also from 2007. But this is more just to give you a bit of an overview. And then there are also these empirical theories. Of course, we here have honored in this conference, we have Christoph Koch here, who's mentioned here twice with this neurobiological theory and also integrated information theory that he has more recently working with Tononi. You see also many others here. Perhaps one could even add kind of computational theories, what Carl Friston is proposing. I haven't got everything here. And I also mentioned a couple of quantum theories. Of course, the best known is Hameroff and Penrose. Penrose, of course, got the Nobel Prize last week, but not for the consciousness theory. But I hope that this will make also physicists give a bit more attention to his ideas about quantum mechanics, which are really quite interesting. I mean, which sometimes people just ignore. Anyway, so that's a well-known theory, but also then something that David Bohm developed and Basil Hiley and myself have been working is this idea of consciousness as emergent from what we call quantum active information. It's not nearly as well known as the Hameroff-Penrose. It's partly because Stuart Hameroff is such a good promoter, and we are a little bit just not so good. But there could be other reasons. It's a joke. Okay, so now you say that, well, why on earth should we bring quantum theory to neuroscience or consciousness? Quantum theory being where we deal with atoms and this very little thingies and small energies and the kind of we think that those kinds of so-called quantum effects, they only would survive in very low temperatures and so on and so forth. And so the usual we have been, I got interested in this approach already in the early 80s. And I did already in my master's thesis at Sussex University when I was working also with David Bohm. I already then wrote about this possibility that quantum effects might come to it, but it's always been a no-no from most the mainstream thinkers. But of course, an idea being that quantum effects are negligibly small in the warm and wet and noisy environment of the brain. But of course, I think people who follow these things, there's been a growing research on things like quantum biology and quantum computation. And so there are being suggestions, and these are now published in the best journals. Doesn't mean that it's the truth, but it means that it's a serious alternative. It's at least being considered now, as opposed to just ignored as it used to be. So people are suggesting that what is known as quantum coherent energy transfer and entanglement may well play a role in photosynthesis and avian magnetoreception, the way the birds can navigate with magnetic field. This stuff you find in nature and all that. If that's a criterion of truth for scientists, I don't know. And you see, and just as an example, something I've been discussing some physicists like Sabrina Maniscalco and some others just now, that you see that the key problem in quantum computers is how to keep coherent quantum states alive long enough so that they can perform the desired computation. And of course, then we have to bring the result to the classical domain. So the quantum classical interface is very important to kind of control. And as far as I heard recently that some quantum computer developers are looking into quantum biological phenomena to find out whether nature has developed mechanisms of protecting quantum coherence from environmental decoherence. And if we can locate such mechanisms in biological systems, maybe we could then kind of mimic them and make them used in quantum information technology, quantum computers. It's a huge program. You know, billions of dollars are put into these quantum computers, and we're not quite sure what will come out of it. Even the Finnish state, I think they put 20 million euro. They want to buy one, but you know, what will it ever do? It's to be seen. You know, but maybe quantum biology will help you. Okay, I just thought I want to give you a little bit of kind of baby quantum mechanics at the top, because in some ways to talk about these things, if you're not familiar with it, it's kind of frustrating. So I do a very quick kind of tutorial, and just to illustrate a bit what the thing is about quantum and how it bases our ideas. And just a way to get into it, there's this two-slit experiment that's just used to illustrate. And of course here, if we do, so we have a situation with this wall with two partitions and then a screen where we can record the results. And here we're shooting some bullets or whatnot. And if you have two holes open, you get two piles on the screen. And that's where, of course, everybody's still with us, usually. This is not difficult. This is not hard. This is the obvious. Now, we could also think of what happens if we put waves through this simulcast system. We know with waves that when they meet, they can either interfere constructively or destructively. They can either add up or cancel each other out. Yeah, and you know, if they cancel each other out, you get nothing. You can see here a little bit, just a very qualitative picture. And here more schematically. So in some directions, wave would add up and then would cancel. And where they cancel, you will get nothing. You will just get zero if it's a good cancellation. Now, most schematically, you can see the what happens that you get then in this kind of situation, you can easily produce something known as an interference pattern where you get waves in some areas and you get nothing on other areas. So you get this kind of alternating fringes. But that's a signature of a wave for physicists. So when a physicist sees this kind of pattern, they say wave phenomenon, a kind of certain kind of periodic phenomenon. And so to get into quantum mechanics, the question is, well, what happens if you pass, for example, little electrons through the two slits? So you see the electron was initially assumed to be a particle. It has things like mass and charge that you could measure. So, initial idea that it was like a little billiard ball or little bullet, and if it would obey classical physics, it should behave like that. So, so this is how physicists expected that the electrons ought to behave. Again, expectation was just the obvious. However, when you finally managed to do the experiment, people discovered this. Actually, this is what you actually observe. So on the one hand, you can see there's a particle-like behavior. What you really see is only the little thingies come there in one by spots, but they produce, instead of making two piles, they make many piles. The picture is misleading because we cannot actually observe the little thingy is moving. This is because of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, but I won't go into that too much. But just compare that, you can see that actually somehow those particles are able to produce the this wave pattern. Okay, and you see we even get an interference pattern if the electrons enter the slit system one by one. And this is a picture from an actual experiment that was carried out just maybe like 30 years ago. So you can see on the left side when you have maybe only 10 particles, and then on the right, maybe 100,000. So you can gradually see the spots, and here you can see it better. And so the thing, this is called kind of wave particle duality, because we think of individual objects that are traveling there. And an individual quantum object would then exhibit both particle properties. It arrives at the detector at a single spot. We also think of it as leaving as a particle. But it also has wave properties because the place where the spot appears is constrained by the mathematics of wave behavior. We can actually use wave mathematics to calculate what we do, calculate probabilities for these things, but still. But there's the idea that, you know, somehow we think that the object itself must have wave properties, because otherwise, how would it know what mathematics obey? And you see, kind of bizarre thing is that opening of second slit can actually prevent an electron reaching a point where it could arrive if only one slit were open. Again, somehow the electron must know whether one or two slits is open. And so the way, if it has a wave property, then that would kind of tell it. But if it's just a particle, how would it know? It goes either to one or the other, and it shouldn't know anything about whether the other is open or not. And of course, we could ask questions. Well, what's happening? Let's you know, what's going on there? And of course, people should tell, we are scientists, let's make an experiment, let's look what happens. But the trouble is that we cannot actually observe the motion of individual electrons in detail. And this again has to do with the Heisenberg indeterminacy principle. Put it naively, if we observe precisely where it is, we have no idea where it's going and vice versa. And you see, you may know this from classical physics, that to predict the movement of a particle, you have to measure both position and momentum at a single moment. But we can't do that as long as we stay within current quantum theory. And this has been the situation for 100 years now. And so without this so-called initial condition, we can't predict what the individual system does. And here comes the famous indeterminism and probability of quantum mechanics into the picture. Here's a little bit of a schema for you, the Heisenberg, how you can see this. But of course, more qualitatively, of course, it's even hit psychoanalysis, where the idea is that you can go through life applying Heisenberg uncentered principle to everything, because if you take quantum mechanics too seriously, then maybe you become as unpredictable, you become too quantum. Anyway, but summarizing the mystery is this, that the electron leave as particles, they arrive as particles one by one to the screen. As a large number of them passes through the system, a pattern builds. We can ask, well, what is the pattern? It's an interference pattern, and interference is a signature of a wave. But then we ask, well, how can the particles sent into the system one by one collectively build up an interference pattern? Surely each individual particle, I put it in the scare quotes now, because it can't be just a particle. It must also have some wave property. How otherwise could it obey this interference? I'm kind of repeating the point, but I just hope you are able to see them. Now, there's a huge discussion of quantum mechanics, all the interpretations. You all may heard about the Schrödinger's cats, many worlds, and consciousness collapse in the wave function, and this and that. And those are, in some ways, I say they're all interesting, they're worth studying. But I also say that there's also a more sober solution explanation of these things. Going back to de Broglie in the 20s, and especially David Bohm in the 50s and later on, where they discovered that actually you can explain all these things. You don't need Schrödinger's, you don't get into Schrödinger cat's problems, you don't get many worlds, you don't need consciousness to collapse the wave function. If you assume that the electron is a particle accompanied with a new type of quantum field which guides it. De Broglie called it the pilot wave. So what happens, I just call it the Bohm theory because Bohm developed it fully. Sometimes it's called the de Broglie Bohm theory, but I call it just the Bohm theory. So you see, it just postulates that an electron is a particle always accompanied with a new type of quantum field which guides. And in this two slits experiment, the particle goes through one of the slits and then appears at the point in a photographic plate. And this explains why you see the spot. And for those who know quantum mechanics, note especially that there is no need to assume collapse of the wave function. You see, why do you assume the collapse of the wave function? In order to explain why you see a spot rather than a wave. But here you're assuming that there is a little thingy, little particle all along. So it's that little particle that does the spot. Now, what about the wave? Well, this accompanying field, a wave, it goes through both slits, interferes afterwards, and guides the movement of the particles so that the particles collectively spot by spot build up an interference pattern. So we actually may be explaining something here. Now, how does the field acquire the particle? Well, the field gives rise to a new type of potential energy, which Bohm called the quantum potential. This is actually something you can see. Basil Hiley has studied very carefully the history. You can see the quantum potential much earlier in literature. They're probably in like a Feynman and Dirac, but it was Bohm who was first to realize the full significance and what you could actually do with it. But it's there, it's kind of implicit in the mathematics of, in the Schrödinger equation, but also other mathematics of quantum mechanics. And here is, you can actually visualize this quantum potential. So now we are looking at the two-slit experiment, those little, what look like little holes, the two things there, those are the holes from which the electrons come. And in physics, when you get a potential, you can think of it as a little bit like a mountain. So when the little particle comes through the hole, it will encounter this mountain. It doesn't want to go all the way up where the thing probably goes to infinity because it's an idealization. Also, if it would go to a hole, it would quickly come back on the other side. It's just a model, it's an idealization. But still, it's nice to go into those level little things that, it stays away from the high peaks and deep valleys, and it's nice to roll along the level. And so you can also calculate trajectories from the Bohm theory for the two slits. And this was supposed to be impossible, you see. So when John Bell, he wrote that in 1952, when Bohm published the papers, he saw the impossible done, because he had been taught that there's no way you could produce a model like this while being consistent with experiments and the Formless quantum theory. This was von Neumann's so-called proof. But anyway, I won't. It's just to show that these pictures have a significance for physicists. They were verboten. I think Chris Duni almost called this the porn of physics, because these things were not supposed to be seen by students. But as a joke, it's not. You shouldn't be seeing these things. But anyway, that they were proposed. And this is a more technical and nicer slide. Basil Hiley, I pinched this from Basil, who knows how to use for those of you who have more mathematical background and it's just the way, what you do here is just that you write the wave function in a polar form, put it in the Schrödinger equation, and then you get the so-called, you get an equation that looks very much like classical physics, Hamilton-Jacobi, but there's an extra term, which is then the quantum potential. And so here again, you can see how the quantum potential and the trajectories go nicely together. You can see that, for example, nobody goes where the potential is very high, the particles don't get there, and the trajectories tend to be here in these areas where it's level. But we're going to be now also looking a little bit about the quantum potential, because the philosophical interesting point is that the quantum potential only depends on the form or the second spatial derivative of the quantum field. Because if you look at this equation for Q, you can see there that the R is the amplitude of the quantum wave. So you can think of, it's like the amplitude of a water wave, but this is a quantum field. And you can see that the R is both in the numerator and denominator and denominator, the size cancels out. It's only, and these, H bar and M, they are constant. So it's only the second spatial derivative that matters. Only the form matters. A small wave will have exactly the same effect as a big wave. It's only only this form that matters, which is kind of an interesting feature. And this led Bohm much later. He didn't, in the 50s, he didn't realize, he actually thought this is a bizarre thing that he wants to get rid of. But then he actually proposed that this quantum potential, we should think of not this field pushing and pulling the particle mechanically. We should more think that it's actually informing. It's a more subtle effect. It's more like information, and the particle is responding to information. So there's something very subtle going on at the quantum level. People usually assume that when you go into smaller and smaller, things get simpler and simpler. Bohm is claiming otherwise. Bohm is claiming that actually the quantum level is complex and subtle, and it's the Newtonian level, the classical world, which we get as an approximation, that's more mechanical and that's more simple. We just have to realize that the quantum world is subtle. But also Bohm would claim we can understand it and we can have a coherent theory. We don't have to get into the paradoxical mess that the quantum mechanics has been for so many years. But anyway, but the next thing to say is that this is not just something in quantum mechanics. Something like this is happening all over the place at many levels of nature, in many other contexts. And here you can think of, for example, think about, of course, a nice analogy. Think about a ship guided by a radar wave. the radar waves are not pushing and pulling the ship. They have the small energy that informs the greater energy of the ship. You know, they are about the environment. They will tell you whether there are obstacles you should avoid. Just like the quantum wave will tell the electron whether one slit or two slits are open, and it will move accordingly. Of course, the electron is much more, in that sense, more simple, but the principle is the same. Of course, computers, we got this kind of thing. But okay, then you say, well, these are all man-made devices, so it's just an analogy. But of course, it's quite common to think that there's active information also in biological contexts. If you think about the way the information contained in the DNA molecule guides protein construction, and no, that is information for the cell. It's not information for us. We too much easily think of, when we use the word information, we always think of ourselves. But Bohm's idea was that information is an objective commodity, exists out there in the world, and it's making things happen. So DNA molecule, the information there is guiding what's happening in the cell. The information in the pilot wave is guiding the movement of the electron, and so on and so forth. So we have to learn to think about information in a different way. And it's actually interesting, there's a good researcher, Anita Goel, who has studied molecular machines that read and write information to molecules of DNA. And she has noted how this sort of, with the DNA molecule, there is this sort of informational processing going on. And I actually met her in a meeting in January, and we talked a lot. She has actually discussed with Basil Hiley, who was Bohm's, my co-worker earlier, and thinks that quantum mechanics might actually come into these processes, and that we should explore the notion of active information at the quantum level. I haven't managed to do that, but I hope that we will be able to do that. And so, but now, of course, for those of you who have been frustrated with all this quantum tutorial or whatever this is, let's get to mind and consciousness, brain and mind. You see, this similar notion applies in human subjective experience. For example, when you're reading a map, the information contained in the map typically gives rise to virtual activities, possible routes in the mind, and one of these is typically realized as an actual movement in the territory, depending on where one wants to go. Similarly, if you're in a building, somebody comes in, shouts fire, you take that seriously, you immediately do something. You don't sort of wait. You don't have to start symbol manipulation or any kind of information is just active in this way. And this was Bohm's claim. Bohm was claiming that information is generally active and passive information is a special case, whereas usually we think the other way around. But he was claiming that because even, the quantum active information explains, for example, chemical bonds, and therefore it's all of this. That's the way the world works, if you like. We just don't realize it. Okay. Now let's move into consciousness. To say that active information applies at the quantum level may be radically interesting, but is it relevant to the hard problem of consciousness? This is the kind of question, why do we bring quantum mechanics when we want to talk about consciousness? Hard problem being, remember, how could physical processes possibly give rise to anything like conscious experience? And so now it so happens, of course, that David Bohm was very interested in philosophical questions, including the mind-body problem. He had discussions with even in Eastern thinkers like Krishnamurti, but he read Piaget and, psychology, it was his. And he actually sketched, this was when I also interacted with him quite a bit. So he was sketching a new theory of mind and matter. And in the first formulation, he wrote that when he thought, thinking about the electrons, he actually said that in some sense, a rudimentary consciousness is present even at the level of particle physics. So he was making a fairly radical claim. Later version of the same article, he qualified it, saying that the quantum theory, which is now basic, implies that the particles of physics have certain primitive mind-like qualities, which are not possible in terms of Newtonian concepts. But then he said, though, of course, they do not have consciousness. So this is a more sober way of putting it. And you see, in philosophy, a big thing right now is this thing called panpsychism, or something pan-protopsychism. And you see, to say that the rudimentary consciousness is present even at the level of particle physics is to endorse this notion of panpsychism. Whereas, let me see, is it, yeah. Whereas to meaning that every even elementary particles would have some primitive experience. To say that particle physics have certain primitive mind-like qualities, but that they do not have consciousness is then a weaker doctrine, pan-protopsychism. And the philosopher David Chalmers has written about this quite a lot, and saying that this we could talk about proto-phenomenal properties that are not phenomenal as such, but when you arrange them, then you get consciousness in the full sense. So here is, the connection to hard problem of consciousness, that if we could claim that we have these proto-phenomenal properties with matter, then we could try to explain consciousness like this. I think even integrated information theory, like with Tononi and Koch, they have another certain kind of appeal to a kind of panpsychism as well. So a lot of people end up doing that. But anyway, so we could say that active information at quantum level has this proto-phenomenal property. There's nothing it is like to be a single electron, but when electrons and other elementary particles fields are arranged in the right structure, for example, that of the human brain, then these phenomenal properties in a full sense emerge from the underlying proto-phenomenal ground. And so I've actually written recently something about that. There's this Routledge handbook of panpsychism, and also like to mention David Skrbina, who is actually been in Helsinki now, and he has also written about, well, a lot about panpsychism, but also about Bohm's views quite well. Okay, and so I will come to a close fairly soon. A few things more about the hard problem of consciousness in the Bohmian scheme. You see, the thing is that, of course, Bohm himself, I mean, if you're interested in the way he was thinking about it, he would say, yeah, we should think of nature as this dynamic process where information and meaning play a key role. But then he would also say that most of this dynamics of information and meaning is not conscious. I think he said in an interview that 99.99% is not conscious. And then, of course, we can ask questions, well, why is there sometimes conscious experience associated with the activity of information? That seems obvious, at least with humans and higher animals. Why doesn't all the activity of information proceed in the dark, as it seems to do in physical and biological processes in general? So this, in a way, okay, we can say things about proto-phenomenal ground, but we're still missing a little bit. It's not a very intuitive explanation. And so, so we could, let me see. Okay, yeah, I have to watch out. The Zoom is a bit difficult because the slides are sometimes covered. So yeah, so there is this, Bohm actually developed this kind of mind matter scheme, which has a hierarchical structure. You have sort of metal level states. So it's what I've tried to suggest, that we could apply this higher order theory of consciousness, where what makes a given state conscious is that they exist at a higher level, like a meta states that's directed to it. This is something that also I discussed with Rocco Gennaro. We thought about, I haven't developed. Of course, other possible solutions, well, we could have Tononi et al.'s integration information theory of consciousness connect to active information. I have actually met also Tononi in January. We talked about some of these things, but I know other people have tried to combine IIT with quantum mechanics. But that's just like, again, I've written some very short paper about just some comparisons. There is also, some of you may know that there's a so-called global workspace theory of consciousness, Bernie Barr's. And one thing you have in this Bohm quantum mechanics, in the many-body systems, you have these common pools of information, which you could think of very much like a global workspace influencing, like in superconductivity, that's the way you understand it, that you have this global state. And so I don't know, I mean, in that sense, we could also, I'm not proposing the Bohm scheme as excluding the other. I think we could still try to think other views as well. Anyway, just a couple of more, slides. So anyway, finally, I'll say a couple of words about the relation to David Chalmers' views, because David Chalmers also, you see, suggested that the notion of information would be important here when tackling the hard problem. He had this kind of double aspect theory. And so as a kind of basic principle, where experience arises by virtue of its status as one aspect of information, and then you have this physical state. And we could do this is actually what I suggested to do, is that we take this idea and postulate that active information has these physical and phenomenal properties. I said proto-phenomenal earlier, right? Now, what about the electron? And I already told you that for Bohm, he didn't think it's conscious. It has this mind-like quality, but not conscious in the full state. So the way I would approach it here is that we would restrict the Chalmers hypothesis and say that certain kind of active information has this potentiality for phenomenal properties. So this would be the proto-phenomenal. A holistic active information that's analogous to quantum active information, but it's only in suitable circumstances that this would be actualized. For example, in the higher order situation where it's an intentional target. We could also have here possibility of genuine artificial consciousness if we could implement this kind of quantum-like holistic active information in an artificial system. And this could be in a quantum computer, but if it would kind of mimic our own biological quantum biological structures, then it's at least conceivable. But if you try to do it with classical physics, it won't work according to this hypothesis. Now, one thing here to realize is that with Chalmers, those of you who knows his theory, this epiphenomenally, so consciousness doesn't really have causal effects. Whereas in our scheme, what I try to show is that we could actually have a possibility of mental causation. And another thing is that Chalmers would also say that maybe activities required for experience and static information, like in information in thermostat, wouldn't have experience associated with. This is what Searle was making kind of fun of Chalmers, saying that maybe even a thermostat is a bit conscious, but Chalmers himself think about it. Now, if we say that phenomenal properties are always properties of some kind of Bohmian active information, we could do justice to the intuition that active is required for experience. So anyway, that's where I end. I think I went the 2 minutes over my time, but thank you very much anyway. And here are just a few references.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pylkkänen, for this very interesting talk. And one question that I would like to start with is, I know that Bohm's ideas were deeply grounded into the idea of wholeness and the implicate order of the universe. And actually, I found a beautiful quotation in your book from Bohm, which says, "The way the thing unfolds the whole is essential to what the thing is." Could you please elaborate a bit on that, what it actually means?
Well, that's interesting. It's I guess, as human beings, we, for example, think of the whole society. We have a view of the whole society, and we go to school and we learn things. We given a culture and prejudice and all that. So that in a way defines what we are. I mean, that would be a very trivial example, but I think that's the sort of thing he means, that we are very implicit. There's so much in us that's we're all the time taking in loads of information, and we of course usually find ourselves in a world. And this is of course what philosophers like Heidegger would say, that our being is being in the world, and we, in that sense, we enfold the whole, and that makes us what we are. Of course, then we respond with our own personal perceptions and hopefully a bit of creativity, but of course often we just fairly mechanically live whatever has been fed into us. I mean, this is of course the but I think he means this kind of thing so he would say things also like that meaning is being, that we are presented things in our education a certain way, and things mean something to us, and that involves values and all kinds of things, and those are the things that make us what we are. And of course, if we become aware of that, there's the possibility of freedom, and that's what's of course one thing that Bohm was very much interested in. I think he was influenced there by his discussions with the Indian philosopher Krishnamurti, that somehow could we become aware of our conditioning, and in that sense maybe have more freedom from the whole that's been fed into us.
Thank you.
Dr. Pylkkänen, we have a question from the audience that I will read it to you. How do you think consciousness might have emerged inside the brain of the very first individual from other lower cognitive processes?
Very good question. I don't know if I have thought about it that way. A lot of people might, it's a tricky, because the question is again, where does experience, come into it? At what level? Where does it come gradually? What point in evolution? People have various ideas about that. I think people who are into this panpsychism, then they don't have the problem because they would say that even the elementary particles have a little bit of experience associated with them. And so people who are not panpsychists, they somehow have to appeal to emergence at some stage. And so the question, of course, people would there appeal to some kind of complexity and saying that when the organism either becomes complex enough, whatever that means, develops some structure. I think the IIT, integrated information theory, would say that it would require a certain value of the phi, a certain variable there. So I don't really personally have an answer to that question, but it's of course a fascinating question, and it would be also a good question to test any theory of consciousness you are given. That of course, Stuart Hameroff, for example, loves the example of paramecium. He loves organisms that do not have neurons, because if some people are very much committed to the idea that you must have nerve cells to have consciousness, then you can find these organisms which do not have neurons. They have only these microtubules, which are definitely still able to behave in sophisticated ways. And you might ask even about them, might they be just a little bit of conscious? And so that's why the mechanism of consciousness could be even at the very fundamental level, like Hameroff and Penrose are proposing. Or it could be just a question of information integration, like Tononi and Koch are proposing.
Yeah, but I think actually the question itself carries kind of predisposition that consciousness emerges from the matter. Right. And again, that's probably the most conventional view, but perhaps not the only one possible.
Right. It's the option, but I'm kind of personally maybe tempted by that, some sort of emergentist view, but somehow I know a lot of people also, more and more people today feel the pull or appeal of panpsychism, but I'm kind of hesitant to go all the way. So I'm sitting on the fence, or anyway, I'm a little bit, I'm still, sometimes I'm if there are 4 alleged panpsychists, like I was in a panel, then I'm the bad guy. So I kind of feel that I don't want to go all the way. So I'm an emergentist, I guess.
Okay, thanks. And then there is another question from the audience. What is your take on Don Hoffman's theory of conscious agents and the underlying mathematical model, which suggests that space-time is not a fundamental property of reality, but rather is seen as a 3-dimensional user interface which conscious agents use to interact with each other?
That's very interesting. I've sometimes heard some of his talks. I haven't read too much of his work. Of course, the question of space-time is, somehow the idea of, in some ways, goes back to at least Immanuel Kant, who said that space and time are forms of our perception. So there's a sense in which we construct the phenomenal world, and so and therefore there are other similar, more, if you like, anti-realist views of space-time. The interesting thing is that if you look at fundamental physics, people like Wheeler, but also Bowman-Hiley, perhaps Penrose, they have a long thought about something they call pre-space. So they have thought that there's, and this is in some ways the idea of the implicate order, that even in the physical universe, what is primary is not space-time, but some kind of more implicit ground from which space-time unfolds. Like when you have a Big Bang, then that's when your space-time starts unfolding. But there existed something even before the Big Bang, and that was, for Bohm, it was the implicate order. For Wheeler, maybe pre-space. So, but then again, I think in this model, I would still be inclined myself to think that there is a kind of, space-time is real. So I'm, in that sense, a realist in relation to it. And I know that some people feel the pull of some kind of subjective idealism. I think maybe Hoffman and of course, Deepak Chopra advocates that quite strongly with some of his colleagues and all that. But there again, I'm more, I think still that, there is space-time and we live in space-time, but that may be emergent. Again, that it doesn't mean that everything has to be reduced to mechanical elements in space-time. That I think reality is deeper, or more exotic than that. But I think it's still there. It's something that Bohm in his theory would call the explicate order, which constantly unfolds from this underlying implicate order.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Pylkkänen. And now we'll have a short break before the next session. And then we will come back to the panel discussion.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the great questions as well. And really a pleasure to talk to you today.